My name is Marnie, and I am a grateful believer in recovery from sexual addiction, anorexia, and grief. Hi. I wish I could begin this story with once upon a time or there once was a little girl, but the truth is far more complicated, darker than any fairy tale. My childhood was shaped by a broken home, relentless abuse, and fits of rage that tore me apart. I was separated from the ones I loved, leaving me adrift in a world that felt hostile and unrecognizable. These experiences pushed me into a world where anything became my escape. Again, my name is Marnie, and I'm a grateful believer, though I still wrestle with the weight of abuse, adultery, and eating disorder, battles that have followed me far longer than I could ever have imagined. My journey toward recovery began at Saddleback Church in November of 2000. I'll never forget that night. I came in broken, barely able to see through the fog of my own life. I felt the weight of everything I had lived pressing down on me. I had no real grasp of reality anymore. Everything was distorted. My life, my choices, my very sense of self, all of it had spiraled out of control. I don't think the enemy could have kept up with the mess I had become. I was unraveling, yet somehow, in that brokenness, I showed up. I had arrived an hour early and sat there in an empty room, my mind a whirlwind of confusion. The walls seemed to close in, and the words of those around me, their laughter, their joy, felt foreign. This isn't my place, I thought. My heart was heavy with shame. I didn't belong here, not with people who seemed so whole. I was just a broken, scattered mess. How could I possibly fit into this? As the band rehearsed in the background, each note felt like a reminder that I was not in control, that life had spiraled beyond my grasp. The music, soothing to others, felt like an alien sound to me, like a language I couldn't understand. My mind raced with all the reasons I should walk out, all the reasons I didn't deserve to be there. What could these people who had somehow found strength to show up, to smile, to embrace, possibly have in common with someone like me? I was so lost in my own thoughts, so deep in the denial I had carried for years that I couldn't even see the invitation in front of me. It was easier to hide, easier to believe that my life could be fixed on my own. I don't need anyone, I thought. I'll fix this. I can do it alone. But even as the thoughts circled in my mind, I felt a strange tug, a pull that I couldn't explain. For all my internal protest, I stayed. Something in me, something buried deep down, was holding me in that seat, even though everything else in me wanted to flee. Maybe it was the tiniest flicker of hope, or maybe it was desperation. I couldn't tell. But I didn't leave, and that small choice, one that felt insignificant at the time, began to shift the course of my life. I think it was then, in the midst of all the noise in my mind, that I started to realize something. Maybe I didn't have it all together. Maybe I didn't have to be perfect. Maybe, just maybe, I could show up as I was, broken, confused, ashamed, and still be accepted. I had spent much of my life pretending, covering up, running from the truth. But here, in this space, I didn't have to pretend. I didn't have to fix anything. I could simply just be. But even then, the denial was strong. I wasn't ready to let go of my armor, not yet. I wasn't ready to admit that I was powerless over my pain, that I had no control over the chaos in my life. But I think that moment, sitting there, uncertain but still present, planted the seed, a seed of possibility, a seed that over time would grow into a deeper understanding of my need for healing, for community, and for grace. As the evening unfolded and the service began, I still felt like a stranger, but in that unfamiliarity, there was a strange kind of peace. I had no answers, no solutions, but I didn't have to. I wasn't expected to fix myself right then and there. The journey ahead would be long, but in that moment, I realized that the hardest part, showing up, was already done. I was startled when a man approached me, put his hand gently on my shoulder, and he said, "Excuse me, but the seat's taken." For a moment, I panicked, not understanding. The room was completely empty, And my heart skipped a beat, but as I looked around, the reality hit me. The seat was indeed taken by humor, and his words were playful. He was kidding. And in that brief, light-hearted moment, something unexpected happened. I felt comforted. I felt seen. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't invisible. The gentle teasing, the kindness in his tone made me feel like I belonged in that room, like it wasn't just a broken soul hiding in the shadows, but a person who could be welcomed in. That small, seemingly insignificant exchange gave me a glimpse of what I had been desperately craving: connection. Maybe I didn't have to keep hiding. Maybe for once I could let go of the walls I'd built to protect myself. I wasn't ready to let go completely, but in that moment, the door to healing cracked open just a little bit wider. The night continued, and I found myself sitting in Newcomers 101, and an experience I could have never anticipated. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. It felt surreal. Here I was, surrounded by strangers, about to confess the darkest secret I had kept buried for so many years. I cheated on my husband. The words barely escaped my lips, barely, more than a whisper. But as soon as they did, I was overwhelmed. The dam that held back years of shame, guilt, and fear broke wide open. I began to sob. I cried for the person I had become, for the betrayal I had caused, for the weight of the lies that had built up between us. In that moment of rawness, I felt something unexpected. Again, grace. The woman leading the group leaned forward, cupped my hands into hers, and said so softly, "Everything's going to be okay. You have come to the right place." Her words, simple yet powerful, wrapped around me like a warm blanket, soothing a part of me I had never known could be healed. For the first time, I believed her, not because I had any answers or even because I understood what healing would look like, but because her voice was so steady. There was no judgment. There was no condemnation, just acceptance. And in that space, I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I could begin to let go of some of the shame that had weighed me down for so long. But before all of this, long before I walked through the doors of Celebrate Recovery, my story began in a place far different than the safety I had just begun to feel. Let me take you back many years to where my story does begin. Long before I was born, the storm of chaos was brewing in my family. Before I had a chance to even take my first breath, my parents had already decided their plans would go separate ways. They divorced, and it wasn't long before I was sent to live with my father and my grandparents in Hawaii, a move that should have been a fresh start, but instead only added layers of confusion. My dad, though physically present, was emotionally distant. He was a functioning alcoholic whose love for women and pornography overshadowed any kind of fatherly responsibility. I grew up watching him drift from one relationship to another while his addictions deepened and consumed him. He wasn't there for me in any real way, and I found myself looking for answers in all the wrong places. Not surprisingly, I mimicked what I saw my dad doing, and at age 7, I tried smoking and tasting beer out of curiosity. At about this same age, I remember the first time I discovered his Playboy collection. It was a day like any other, my curiosity driving me to snoop through his things when he wasn't home. I stumbled upon the stack of magazines hidden in his dresser drawer, and in that moment, my world shifted. I didn't fully understand what I was seeing, but I left an imprint. A seed of confusion and longing was planted deep within me, and I couldn't shake it. I remember feeling torn. Part of me wanted to run away from what I had just found, but another part of me was inexplicably drawn to it. The images felt wrong, yet oddly fascinating. They became a part of me, a part of the distorted lens through which I would view relationships, intimacy, and body image for years to come. There were many moments like that, times when I was left alone in the corners of his relationships, abandoned while he retreated into the bedrooms of his girlfriends. I was often left in the living room, turned into an unwilling spectator of a life I never chose. In those moments of neglect, I was learning patterns that would follow me long into adulthood. Despite the turmoil, there was some light. My grandparents. They became my refuge. They showed me what love could look like. They taught me about Jesus, and through their example, I began to understand the Christian values that would later become my lifeline. My grandparents' love and faith filled the void that my parents' dysfunction created, and for a time, it was enough. Yet, no matter how loving and stable my grandparents were, the shadow of my parents' choices haunted me. And as I grew older, I couldn't escape the resentment I held towards my father. He was a man who never really saw me, who never really protected or nurtured me. The wounds he left ran deep, and for years I held on to them tightly, refusing to forgive. When I was about 6 years old, I was sent back to California to live with my mother. Over the next 10 years, I would endure a constant barrage of physical, verbal, and emotional abuse at her hands. Her temperament was that of a raging alcoholic, but without alcohol. "Mommy dearest" is the phrase that often comes to mind when I think of her. One memory that stands out above the rest was I was packing for a camping trip with family friends when I accidentally walked in on one of her violent outbursts. Her strike was hard and fast, so hard that when she hit me, my tooth punctured my lip. The next day, my face was swollen, my lip was split, and I had a huge black eye. When people asked how it happened, I lied, of course, saying that I had been eating and that my fork had slipped. She would always apologize afterwards, claiming she hated what she had done, that she loved me. But in the very next breath, she would tell me I deserved it. I lost count of how many times I ended up in the emergency room as a child. I remember the doctors asking, "Did your mother hit you?" And I would always respond with a stoic face and a quiet nod of my head, "No." My mother was always sent out of the room when he asked, but I knew better than to speak the truth. I was too afraid of what might happen if I did. Throughout my childhood, I became a human piñata. Being choked, slapped, dodging mirrors, being thrown violently through the air were episodes that happened on a regular basis. I was beaten with inanimate objects like lamps, hangers, high-heeled shoes, and whatever else was at hand's reach. To cope with my dysfunctional life, I escaped into a fantasy life filled with lustful thoughts and pornographic images that were embedded in my mind. I would stay in bed for hours fantasizing about sex, only to have the women from my dad's Playboy collection playing some of those roles. My childhood was marked by constant turmoil, leaving me no choice but to escape the chaos that surrounded me. Just before my senior year of high school, I made the decision to emancipate myself. At 17, I was legally recognized as an adult, and I moved out to live on my own. I was determined to break free from the cycle of dysfunction that had defined my life. But despite my efforts, I soon realized that I had become a product of the very environment I had tried to escape. Years later, in June of 1998, I married my high school sweetheart. Despite having been together for 8 years before we tied the knot, our marriage quickly became more difficult than I ever expected. It felt as if overnight we had drifted miles apart. The connection we once shared seemed to vanish, and the conversations that used to flow naturally now felt forced and superficial. Financial struggles began to weigh heavily on us, and we were living with his parents, adding more to the strain of an already fragile situation. Bitterness, resentment, and frustration began to take over, and my once hopeful vision of a normal life started to crumble. For months, we fought constantly, broken promises piling up between us. I felt stuck, like I was running in place, giving everything but receiving nothing in return. I felt taken for granted, disrespected, and unseen. My voice was lost, and my sense of control slipped away. I felt as though my dreams had been stolen from me, but most painfully, I felt emotionally bankrupt, unable to give any more of myself. That's when my inner turmoil erupted. In a desperate attempt to escape the suffocating weight of my feelings, I sought solace in adultery. Just 10 months into my marriage, I betrayed my husband. I started to drink heavily and eat less and less. As my addictive behaviors took hold, I took a new job that required me to travel from Southern California to Northern California Monday through Thursday. The time away from my husband gave me a sense of freedom, freedom to make my own choices, to feed my unhealthy impulses. In my denial, life felt intoxicating. I was receiving attention from men, strangers who barely knew me, but it didn't matter. Each day, I became more detached from my marriage, growing increasingly independent. For the first time, I felt in control of my life, as if I were finally living on my own terms instead of following someone else's rules. But deep down, I knew something was desperately wrong. I struggled with the growing divide between the Christian values I'd been raised with and the way the world seemed to embrace the behaviors that, at a time, felt like an escape. It was as though the faith I'd known as a child had become something I understood intellectually, but no longer lived or felt in my heart. For the first time, my faith in God was tested and ultimately shaken, because by then, my relationship with him had faded into nothingness. I ignored the discomfort, replacing it with alcohol, anorexia, and adultery. I had become lost in a self-destructive spiral consumed by deception. My life, in a strange and painful way, had become a twisted reflection of the women I had been warned against in my childhood teachings of the Bible: Jezebel, Potiphar's wife, and Delilah. Yeah, Delilah. I had become the woman whose greatest accomplishment was the destruction of the man who loved her most. My forbidden lifestyle became a double life. I continued to maintain the various facades I had perfected over the years. At work, I was the polished, poised professional, always in control, always composed. But once I walked into my office and closed the door, I was a different person. I would escape into internet pornography and chat rooms, a secret world of deception that I kept hidden from everyone. When I was with my college friends, I played the innocent one, the codependent Marnie who never drank, but always took care of the rest of the others when they did. Church, I was the good Christian, sitting on the concrete bench outside, pseudo-listening, while making sure everyone knew I was present and accounted for. But the real Marnie, the uninhibited Marnie, came to life after work hours. I would hit the bars with coworkers, hang out with the good old boys club, and tell dirty jokes just to fit in. The more I drank, the more I talked. The more I talked, the more I blamed my circumstances for my behavior. My drinking buddies became the audience for the unvarnished version of my life, a story of how terrible things were at home. I no longer cared about respect or boundaries. I became reckless, disrespecting myself and everyone around me. My insatiable hunger for more grew as I tried to fill the emptiness inside me, but nothing seemed to satisfy the monster. My form of self-punishment and control took the shape of anorexia, both physically and spiritually. I became obsessed with my body, focusing on image over everything else, even the people I loved most. My quest for the perfect body consumed me. Starving myself gave me a false sense of control, as if I were making the decision for my life, as if I had the power over something, anything. My rigid diet consisted of a handful of grapes each day and copious amounts of Diet Coke. I chose what went in my body. I decided what I would look like. I pushed myself to run 12 to 15 miles a day, obsessed with burning more and more calories. The lack of nutrition, burning fuel, coupled with my sexual addiction, left me physically weak, drained, and completely out of fuel. I weighed barely 92 pounds with a hollowed out face that reflected the self-destruction I was so deeply entrenched in. My addiction had taken full control. As I watched the scenes of my life unfold, I became desperate to break free from the web of deception I had woven around myself. I reached out and called Saddleback Church, and they suggested I tried to celebrate recovery. It was during this time that memories of the Christian values my grandparents had instilled in me as a child began to resurface. Values I had buried under layers and layers of anger and resentment toward God. But now, in my desperation, God had finally gotten my attention. I had been struck with the sudden, undeniable truth. I was trapped in a cycle that I couldn't break on my own. It felt as though I had been hollowed out, and the great parts of the life I had built was slowly being erased before my eyes. It was in that moment that I realized the truth of Romans 7:15, that I don't understand myself at all, for I really want to do what is right, but I can't. I do what I don't want to, what I hate. I know perfectly well that what I'm doing is wrong, and my conscience proves that I agree with these laws I am breaking, but I cannot help myself. It is the sin living in me that makes me do these things. I didn't know how to reconcile the broken pieces of my past, but in that moment of clarity, the pain became greater than the fear, and I had finally reached my bottom. This brings us back to the beginning of my testimony. It was then that I attended my first Celebrate Recovery meeting, sitting in that tent all alone. 2 months after that first life-changing night at Celebrate Recovery, a women's step study opened up. I picked up a Bible and a set of Celebrate Recovery participant guides and began my pilgrimage through the 12 steps alongside women who understood me and who, for the first time, I felt I could truly relate to. In that space, secrets seemed nearly impossible to keep. At first, I kept myself at a safe distance. I guarded my secrets, convinced that if anyone knew the real me, they could use it to hurt me. I felt hideously ugly, like the scars of my past were visible to everyone around me. But as I began to share, something surprising happened. I saw women who simply stayed silent, listening with compassion, without judgment. For the first time, I began to understand that the internal struggle I had been carrying, it wasn't unique to me. It was something I shared with other women in my group. That was the turning point. I started to realize how deeply the pains of my past had shaped my behavior. I began to see that I had been trapped in a cycle of addiction for most of my life. I had learned to view men as objects, repeating the patterns of my childhood, and I had kept so many secrets. Childhood secrets, secrets from in my adult life, and even secrets in my marriage. Saying those secrets out loud felt like bringing truth into my reality. I also began to accept that I could never be perfect, that perfection didn't exist. There was no such thing as a perfect marriage or perfect body, and most painfully, I saw just how far I had drifted from my relationship with Christ. I remembered the words of Psalm 40, Verse 12, that problems far too big for me to solve are piled higher than my head. My sins, too many to count, have all caught up with me, and I am ashamed to even look up. In that moment, I felt both the weight of my failures and the hope of a path forward. My journey was just beginning. I began venturing into uncharted territory at Celebrate Recovery. It was after working Principle 4 where I openly examined and confessed my faults to myself, to God, and to someone I trust, that true healing began. In that moment, I heard God's promise of freedom, and for the first time in a long while, I stopped acting out. It was then that I understood Luke 12. It was then that I realized that whatever is covered up will be uncovered, and every secret will be made known. So then whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in broad daylight. As I laid my sins at the foot of the cross, I turned away from my addictions, and God declared me not guilty. In that moment, again, I was reminded of his grace. He blotted out the charges proved against you, the list of his commandments which you had not obeyed. He took this list of sins and destroyed it by nailing it to Christ's cross. Colossians 2:13. God, in his grace, allowed for healing. Years before my father passed away, he reached out, offering an olive branch I never expected. We reconciled. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Had we not, I would have carried that bitterness to his grave. I would have grieved him differently, and my healing would have been stunted. My husband and I reconciled, and our marriage endured for 23 years. He passed away suddenly in 2021, but I can say with certainty that had we not reconciled, just as I had with my dad, I would be grieving him in a very different way. As for my mom, I have found it in my heart to forgive her. Though the journey has been long, there has been small but significant fruit that has blossomed. I am now willing to take a chance on the possibility of healing in that relationship as well. The deeper I went into my journey with Celebrate Recovery, the more I began to see just how intricately God had been working in the background of my life, even when I couldn't see it. For so many years, I had felt lost in the mess of my decisions, believing the lie that I was beyond redemption. But as I started to peel back the layers of shame, guilt, and self-doubt, I realized something profound. God was never done with me. It took time, it took pain, and it took a willingness to face the truth about myself. But it was only when I was finally honest, completely honest with myself, with God, and with those who walked alongside me, that the healing began to truly take root. The shame that had once bound me so tightly began to unravel, and for the first time in my life, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. Through Celebrate Recovery, I learned that it's not the weight of our sins that defines us, it's what we choose to do with them that determines our future. I learned the process of confession, of acknowledging the brokenness, was not to shame me further, but to free me. Every step I took in this program, each honest confession, each prayer, each moment of surrender, was a step toward the freedom that God had promised all along. As I worked through the 12 steps and shared my story with others, I began to experience God's love and grace in ways I could have never imagined. I realized that the darkest parts of my past, the abuse, the alcohol, the anorexia, the shame, the betrayal, the anger, didn't have to define who I was anymore. I was no longer a prisoner of my past. I am a child of God, redeemed and restored. My sins are forgiven, and the shame that I had carried for so long no longer had a hold over me. The more I shared my story, the more I understood how it wasn't just my healing that mattered, it was the healing of those around me. I began to see that my pain, when surrendered to God, could be used for His glory. I realized how much I missed in those years of hiding, living in fear of being exposed. But God had a plan all along. He was waiting for me to stop running from my past and to face it head on with Him by my side. And when I did, everything began to change. The woman I am today is not the same one who walked into Celebrate Recovery all those years ago. The transformation has been nothing short of miraculous. God has taken the very things I thought would destroy me and used them for good. The lies I once believed about myself, about my worth, about my future, have been replaced with His truth. I am no longer bound by the chains of my addiction, my shame, or my past mistakes. And as I look back, I see the thread of grace that has run through it all, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the beautiful. It was grace that brought me to Celebrate Recovery. It was grace that healed my heart. It was grace that helped me forgive my mother, reconcile with my father, and restore my marriage. And it is grace that continues to hold me in its embrace day after day. My life now is a reflection of God's faithfulness. Through the work He's done in me, I found a calling to serve others, to help them find the same freedom I've discovered. As part of the traveling Celebrate Recovery Conference team, I am reminded that every time I board a plane or fly for work, that God is using what was once caused my destruction to now bring about His restoration. I think back to those days when I was lost, when I was deep in the pit of my addiction, shame, and self-loathing, and I realize how far I've come. I've been made whole in ways I never thought possible. I've found new purpose, a new identity, and a new understanding of who I am in Christ. The same power that raised Jesus from the dead is the same power that lives in me. And with that power, I can walk in victory, not on my own strength, but in His. The journey is not over, it's ongoing, but with each step I grow stronger. With each day, I become more rooted in God's truth. And I know that no matter what lies ahead, God will continue to lead me out of the darkness and into His marvelous light. As I reflect on all that God has done in my life, I'm reminded of His promises. The same promises that spoke to me in my brokenness now echo in my heart with strength and certainty. He says in Deuteronomy, even though you are at the ends of the earth, the Lord your God will go and find you and bring you back again. It is a promise that never fails. It is a promise to hold on to, knowing that no matter where I go, God is always there, leading, guiding, healing, and restoring. God calls us to kneel at the foot of the cross, but that isn't where we're meant to stay. God commands us, pick up your cross and follow me. Thank you for letting me share.